Stop scrolling. You need to stop eating these 5 things immediately today. Dairy. Dairy is terrible for you.
Did you know there are over 5,000 mammals on this planet and humans are the only one that will drink the milk from another animal's mammary gland?
Chock full of hormones that do not belong in your body.
So bad, I want to give you a 0, but that's not possible. So I give you a 1.
Hi everyone, I'm Rubina.
And I'm Layla.
Welcome back to our channel, Nutrition Unpacked,
where we test out diets so you don't have to. This week we're going to try the dairy-free diet. This has kind of been culminating as a trend over the past, I'd say, 10 or so years. I've been seeing a lot more people promoting a dairy-free way of living.
Just to be clear, for the purposes of this video, we're going to be focusing more on the nutrition side of dairy. Of course, we know that when it comes to the conversation around dairy, there is a lot more animal cruelty, environmental concerns. Those are all super valid and important topics, but just for the purposes of our videos here, we are going to kind of narrow our scope and focus more on the nutrition side of things.
Stay in our lane on this one. So if anyone's an environmental specialist or an animal activist, let us know about what your thoughts on dairy are below, but we're staying in our lane when it comes to nutrition and what people are saying in the nutrition space.
I think there's been a general push maybe towards a little bit more plant-based lifestyles. Dairy has also been actively vilified.
There's no biological requirement for milk. It may have not only a lack of health benefits, but a lot of potential harms.
Let's talk about it. What is dairy, first of all?
Honestly, I feel like that's a pretty basic question, but you'd be surprised. I've had a lot of people ask me if eggs are dairy. I'm lactose intolerant and my brother takes it very, very seriously. And I forget what it was, but he's like, actually, you know what? I think that has eggs in it. I'm like, actually, eggs are not dairy. Dairy refers to milk and all of the things made out of milk. Milk is the excretion of the mammary glands of a mammal.
Cow's milk is probably one of the most common forms of dairy, but we see sheep's milk, goat's milk. Have you tried any of those?
I am lactose intolerant and I have been since I was a very young child. I've heard goat's milk is supposed to be lower in lactose. I honestly don't know if that's true, so I have tried goat's milk. I will say it is very
goaty,
very sweaty.
I haven't tried either of those, but not for any reason. I don't think I've ever been presented with the opportunity, and I've never sought it out myself either.
Well, I think they do have goat's milk at some grocery stores.
They do. I see it, I pass by it, and my brain doesn't totally process it.
But you have had goat cheese, right?
I love goat cheese.
Yeah, I do like goat cheese.
Goat cheese on a beet salad? So why is this even a topic of conversation? I think dairy has gotten such a bad name in the wellness space lately. There's kind of a lot of claims about it being inflammatory, about it contributing to disease, about how our bodies can't process it. It contributes to weight gain and bloating and all sorts of different things. Plant-based alternatives are very much actively promoted as a result.
I don't know, when I was growing up, dairy was hailed as this superfood. We got it at lunch. You had the advertisements from Got Milk.
I don't want milk. Well, I happen to know that milk helps build strong bones. Well, Mr. Miller told me he never drinks milk.
Oh, that's not good.
Got milk.
It's gonna help you grow, it's gonna help your bones. And dairy was seen as this really huge superfood. So I'm kind of amazed to see how in such a short period of time, it's gone from a health hero to the health supervillain. I think there's an increased knowledge about lactose intolerance. People are becoming more and more aware of both dairy allergy and also lactose intolerance. We've seen lots of concerns about hormones, and the food guides or at least the Canada Food Guide has gotten rid of the dairy section. So I think kind of all those things are coming together, driving this concern about dairy and a decrease in consumption of dairy.
I think a lot of people are going through a lot of maybe health related concerns. They aren't quite being diagnosed properly, whether it's digestive distress or bloating or, having trouble losing weight or whatever it might be. If we can maybe pinpoint or identify that maybe it's dairy, maybe it's gluten, maybe it's something else, it provides hope for people that maybe that's the solution and they can resolve some of their issues.
Within the wellness influencer space, they've kind of really taken this and ran with it.
Food industry has taken advantage as well. You see aisles of food that says dairy free, vegan, this, that, and it's very much
hey, this is a healthier alternative, this is a better alternative.
Even a lot of wellness people, they'll pick up these products and say, hey, this is dairy free, and they really like to highlight the fact that it's supposedly a healthier alternative because it's dairy free.
When you're talking to people about how to live a plant-based life, we have to consider that all of these substitutions aren't necessarily nutritionally similar.
So let's talk about the nutritional profile of dairy products. Dairy products do tend to be higher in calcium, protein, as well as B vitamins like riboflavin and B12. Things like milk are also fortified with vitamin D.
In the Western context, dairy provides a significant source of calcium and protein. It provides over 50% of calcium for a lot of people. There are some differences when you look at age groups, and it provides at least a fifth of protein for a lot of people.
One thing that I've been really happy to see more recently is a lot of the plant-based alternatives. It does seem like the food industry has, I don't know, I guess taken the initiative to fortify those products with things like calcium and vitamin D and vitamin A and some even B12. You kind of alluded to the fact that when you were growing up, maybe soy milk was kind of your only option and it was probably less than stellar in terms of flavor and stuff. So I'm happy to see in general that there's so many more options, like whether it's cheeses, yogurts, ice creams, or straight up milk alternatives. That we're seeing so much more diversity. And I think a lot of them are actually delicious, right? Like I know oat milk had its kind of craze a couple of years ago.
I will say we've come leaps and bounds when it comes to vegan cheese, because I don't know, way back when you had vegan cheese, disgusting. I will say, I had this joke with my fellow lactose people, is that lactose intolerance is not just a gastrointestinal disease, it's also a psychiatric issue. You are delusional about the amount of dairy that you can eat. Like, I think part of being lactose intolerant is really pushing the limits of your lactose intolerance.
So it's like a sadistic or which one?
Masochistic, I think.
Which is the one where you want to be in pain?
I think it's
The masochism?
Yes, I think so. Yeah. So it's a little bit of a masochistic condition. There's a little bit of delusion involved. I know, and people close to me know, that I do push the boundaries when it comes to things like cheese, ice cream, quite often, more often than I probably should.
But she's kind enough to give you a heads up. Let's talk about, is it actually as harmful as is often being kind of promoted in the wellness space?
I think the claims about dairy being harmful are really far ranging. You know, some of that does actually come from science. I know for a really long time they're like,
you need to be eating skim milk, otherwise you're gonna have a heart attack.
When we were very fearful of saturated fatty acids.
Saturated fat, that is kind of, I think, a concern that comes up in like the medical and health space quite often. And a lot of the nutrition and public health guidelines do generally call for a reduction in saturated fat intake, whether that's coming from dairy or meat products. So a lot of the guidelines do say to kind of encourage people to choose like the low fat alternatives when it comes to the dairy context. And the reason for that is that, you know, a lot of research over the years has found maybe an association between the consumption of saturated fat and cardiovascular disease. That being said, I think more recently there's been maybe a little bit more of a question mark on kind of how concrete that link actually is, and is it purely the saturated fat specifically, or is it the types of foods that saturated fats might happen to come from?
We eat foods, not nutrients. So we have to really look at the food as a whole. People aren't wrong when they say dairy has a lot of saturated fat. In the UK, dairy intakes contribute between 25 and 40% of the saturated fat intake, which is not insignificant. That's quite a bit. But then when we look at the food as a whole, dairy, despite being high in saturated fat, actually doesn't seem to show links to cardiovascular disease, and in some studies actually may be protective.
There was an overview of meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials that actually found that dairy consumption did not have a significant effect on various biomarkers that tend to be associated with risk for cardiovascular disease, including blood pressure and cholesterol. Another meta-analysis of cohort studies found that those that had the highest intakes of dairy when compared to those that had the lowest intakes of dairy, it actually seemed to modestly reduce risk for things like hypertension, coronary heart disease, and stroke.
This is what we mean when we don't talk about nutrition science being very, very complicated. For a very long time we had this association of saturated fatty acids and cardiovascular disease, and it just being generally overall bad for you. But then when we look at the evidence and look at the food as a whole, it actually seems to be protective. So, if people are trying to reduce their dairy intake for a health perspective, it might be a little bit counterintuitive. When we look at things like diabetes, which was another claim that's been made, dairy actually seems to be protective for the risk of developing diabetes.
Even when dairy was included in the Canada's food guide, they're still encouraging people to choose the lower fat alternatives. But I know there's research in children that actually shows that the higher fat alternative seems to reduce risk for being overweight or obese. And it's thought that because the higher fat alternative is likely more safe satiating, it might actually end up helping moderate overall intake.
Even when they're looking at these studies of, risks of cardiovascular disease and things like that, they do often separate low fat, high fat, different sources. Low fat dairy reduces the risk of hypertension and stroke, and high fat dairy also reduces the risk of stroke. I think that this really attention to one nutrient has had quite a detriment for people's consumption of dairy and potentially people's health in the long term. Something else interesting with dairy is that not only does it contain saturated fat, it contains trans fats. Focusing just, trans fats are bad, making that parallel that, dairy must be bad for this fat, isn't necessarily true, because we found that the types of trans fats in dairy products are actually beneficial for heart health. They're called conjugated linoleic acids. And so these are naturally occurring in dairy, and alternatively to the trans fats you'd find in processed foods, are actually beneficial.
Let's talk about cancer. A lot of the anti-dairy messaging that you see on social media, I think there's fear around hormones and possibly how that could play into cancer risk. Research suggests that it's actually inversely related to colorectal, bladder, breast, and gastric cancers.
When we look at other types of cancer like pancreatic, ovarian, or lung cancer, we actually don't really see an association. However, when we look at the effect of dairy on prostate cancer, the results are kind of mixed. Generally, when we look at the risk as a whole, we see that having more dairy can reduce the risk of a lot of different types of cancers.
What are we gonna do over the next week? We are gonna try to go dairy-free and see how that impacts our nutrition.
Honestly, because I'm lactose intolerant, I never grew up eating too much dairy, so I don't eat too much.
I mean, I've never eliminated dairy intentionally, but to be honest, dairy is not a huge part of my diet. So I am curious to see actually what my calcium intakes look like, because I actually really doubt I'm meeting my calcium target. Being females under the age of 50, we're supposed to be aiming for 1,000 milligrams per day.
So what we're gonna do, since we are lacking in the dairy and calcium department, is the first day we are going to eat what we normally eat and track our calcium intakes. The next day we are going to try and get enough calcium, because I'm pretty sure I'm not getting enough calcium.
I'm for sure not.
Yes.
I think I'd be pretty proud if I'm even hitting 50%.
And then the following days, we're gonna go completely dairy-free and try to keep hitting that calcium target, as well as hitting the protein target. Because as we talked about, dairy is a big contribution to people's protein intakes.
I mean, I'm glad that those plant-based milks, a lot of them have calcium fortification now. What else am I gonna do? Have salmon with bones and stuff?
Some bok choy,
broccoli, lean into those vegetables.
Yeah.
Oh, tofu. You know what? I've been wanting.
Yes.
Yes, calcium fed tofu. I've never prepared tofu myself, actually. And it's been on my mind for a year that I want to play around with tofu.
Right.
And I finally have the incentive to do it.
Now's your time. Okay. So yeah, I'm pretty excited for this, because definitely not getting enough calcium as it is. So I'm going to pick up some tips and tricks and then hopefully be able to share it with all of you.
Anyone that's been dairy-free for a long time, or if you just have knowledge on how to kind of amp up our calcium intake without the use of dairy products, give us your tips. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a video, and follow us on Instagram and TikTok.
Thanks for watching. Bye.